Thank you, Holland, and welcome to all. It's a great pleasure to be here today and to be able to speak briefly on the subject that has been assigned here. I was wondering, how did I get this particular honor? I'm not a politician, I'm not a weatherman, and then it came to me, I survived the ballistic missile attack on Hawaii last week. I was there. It was very interesting. No, I'm here, I think, because I was the founding director of PEER and saw a lot of things that several of you saw or maybe heard of, or some of you don't know anything about. And so I wanted to give a somewhat light view back at some of the things that happened and some of the history for the Pacific Earthquake Engineering Research Center. And I think it's obvious by the attendance here today that PEER is succeeding, that there's great interest in the developments of PEER and the ongoing activities of PEER. It's always healthy to look back, and it takes some time to be able to look back at history and have a good sense of it. You can't do it as soon as it's finished. And so here we are 10 years after I finished my term, 11 years almost after I finished my term as the first director of PEER, to give sort of an overview of some of what was there. Those who were around at the time might remember a book entitled Impure Science, which I think it was chapter 3. It was a chapter on handing out the big money. And handing out the big money had to do with NSF's decisions at certain times to fund big research centers, including at some point big research centers in earthquake engineering. And the first competition was way back in 1985-86 timeframe, when it was approved for the National Science Foundation to compete for a national earthquake center. And of course, a competition ensued, and there were great hopes all around on this center coming to California, and there were great hopes elsewhere. And ultimately, the decision was made by National Science Foundation in their wisdom to situate the center at the State University of New York at Buffalo. And it was a tremendous blow to the research community in California and elsewhere on the West Coast, that we had assumed, I think, that this was the right place for the Earthquake Engineering Center. But it didn't happen that way, and things don't always turn out as you think they might. But it provided an opportunity to regroup and to rethink approaches. It provided the opportunity for forming the California Universities for Research in Earthquake Engineering, CURI, which later grew to be a bigger organization. And it also instilled in the Seismic Safety Commission in California, in the legislature in California, the importance of stepping up the next time if ever this opportunity came back around. And lo and behold, it came back around with a competition for up to 3 earthquake centers in 1996. And in that competition, CURI organized a group, representatives from each of the main universities conducting research in earthquake engineering in California, put together a committee, debated where this center should be, generally what its subject should be, but mainly at first where to place the headquarters, who should be in charge of the center. And after a vote, it was decided to place the center in its current location. I won the honor of being the first director, and the shift occurred at that time to begin putting together what was to be the proposal for this center. And so there were representatives at that time from UC Davis, UC Irvine, UCLA, UC San Diego, Stanford, Caltech, and USC, working to put a proposal together. And eventually it grew into a proposal also including the University of Washington. And that proposal went forward and was successful, along with proposals for 2 other centers to move forward. Now, you have to also, I think, understand where we were 21 years ago. And there were competing visions for what an earthquake center should be. On the one hand, the Structural Engineers Association of California had just completed its Vision 2000 report. Performance-based engineering was all the rage at the time, although there were not many ideas on exactly how to pull this off. Also, though, the Kobe earthquake, or the Great Hanshin earthquake, had occurred that same year. And so, in the year before, the Northridge earthquake. So there was a competing interest to have an earthquake center that looked at urban earthquake risk mitigation. And so there were these competing ideas, and we tried to figure out how to fit them together. And we ended up with something like performance-based earthquake engineering for urban hazard reduction or risk reduction. And in the end, as things developed, we shifted more toward the left and away from the vision on the right. But the idea on the right of the Kobe earthquake and other things still came out in one way. This is the first logo for Pier. And at the time, it was an unknown entity, and so it was important that around the logo we know today, it said Pacific Earthquake Engineering Research, and I always felt like, where's the next word? But with time, that shortcoming was set aside because we got rid of the banners around the outside. Anyway, does anybody recognize what's in the middle? Bay Bridge? No, not a Bay Bridge, not a bridge. It's intended to represent a near-fault earthquake ground motion pulse. That was the idea. How could you not know that sitting here all these years? Well, now you know. So one or two knew. But I met, one of the first and most important things, you've got to have a logo. We met with PR people and paid them to come up with a logo. They said, well, here's where we're going to put it on a coffee cup and give us some images. And so I sketched something like this that looked like a pulse in my mind. And lo and behold, there it was. So there's another logo that looks almost just like this that has nothing to do with earthquake engineering. But I think that didn't last as long as ours did. Now, we had very early on the idea that we needed to work all the way from the earth science side through engineering up into the social sciences. It was pretty clear that we had to cover a broad base in doing so. And it wasn't too long in that we started developing our own language. I think within even the first year, maybe second year, we had the idea of an intensity measure, an EDP, a damage measure, and a decision variable. And the language was very peculiar at the time. But it ended up sticking. We didn't know what the heck to do with it, though. What were we going to develop as a performance calculation tool? And so what we did is we held meetings, lots of meeting with practicing engineers and researchers and others to try and flesh out or get the inspiration for what this would be. And it turned out in one of our presentations, and I think the very first year, Bill Holmes, a bit younger Bill Holmes, came and presented a slide that looked pretty much like this. It was sort of Ron Hamburger's Joe's Bar, to which he had added along the bottom axis the notion of percent replacement and casualty rate and downtime days. And Mr. Holmes said, this is what we need, this is what you've got to do. And we grabbed onto this idea, and this kind of became the vision for putting together the Earthquake Center. We wanted to develop that. We still didn't quite know how to do it, but that's where we put all our energies, was into doing this. And Bill, I think, deserves the credit for having inspired the thought to do it that way. In terms of the integration of ideas and so forth, it took time. Again, it took meetings, it took a lot of work. And at one point, the two gentlemen in the upper right, Cornell and Crowwinkler from Stanford, put forward a newsletter article that I think had two integrals in it, which some of us thought was too many already. And by the time it had gotten down about 6 months from there were three. And then Helmut was talking about a fourth one, and I said, no, this is it. 3 is all we can handle, because it was sort of scary. What do you mean, the slope of the hazard curve? What the heck is that? And so a lot of people looked at this and said, this is too complicated. You can't make any sense. You can't get anything useful out of this. Our lead social scientist on the research committee, Peter May from University of Washington, shrugged his shoulders and he said, this is just a reductionist view of the world. It's too simple. And so Peter got around it by sort of ignoring the complexities and saying, it's not good enough. Now, the question really becomes, though, how do a bunch of people who are trained to work in their own independent disciplines, to be experts in a more narrow field, how do they work together? And at one meeting, Greg Fendris came. Not Greg Deerline came. Greg Fendris was hanging out there and told us the parable of the blind men and an elephant, which had originated on the ancient Indian continent. And the idea was that the blind men, or the blindfolded people, were brought in to touch various parts of the elephant. And one would touch the tail and say, oh, it's a rope. And one would push on the body, it's a wall, it's so solid. And someone would grab the leg, oh, it's a trunk of a tree. And where is Greg? I'm still not sure I understand the purpose of this slide. But, but I think the idea was it's okay to know and be really good at the part that you touch, that you can understand, but we're going to have a way of also knowing how the pieces fit together so we can understand the whole elephant. It was a great story. I still don't know if I got the lesson correct or not, but it was nice. And I remembered it and found it. Now, integrating things required a lot of work. Things don't come easily. It's not like somebody said, oh yeah, let's go do this. We met, and we met, and we met, and we met as engineering seismologists, and geotechnical and structural engineers and social scientists. We were very careful when we went into the social sciences area. We were interested not in how people responded to earthquakes, how did they feel about them. We wanted to know, how could you measure in terms that made sense to the public, to owners, to decision makers? How could you measure what it was that was important to them? That's what we wanted there. And we met and we met and we worked and so forth. And over time, different people who knew the different parts of the elephant were communicating, and they started coming up with solutions. Here's one example. I'll pick 3 people who worked on this and were instrumental in this. We were trying to get to what was the cost, the dollar losses associated with earthquakes spanning over many years. The capability just didn't exist, and we needed to finish this idea and put this together before year 10 was over. And so Craig Comartin, practicing engineer, who knew the ins and outs, the bits and pieces of how engineers put buildings together and what all the pieces that have to come together, how are they cataloged? Because in his idea, the way you calculate and catalog the losses has to be consistent with the way things are acquired in the building. At the bottom, Professor Dick Karigian, I thought I saw Armin in the room today. He was the expert who knew how to do the simulation and how to interpret the results in a really important way. And Tony Yang, I don't think Tony's here. Tony was the graduate student who knew how to do it and who put this together in a record time under an emergency situation to develop this predecessor really of the software PACT and of SP3. Jack Baker, you're here, you're associated with that. Is Kurt Hazelton in the room? Not in the room yet, but anyway, you represent the company, right? In consideration of the fact that the Pacific Earthquake Engineering Research Center provided the kernel for this great idea, this great tool that you guys have developed, can we get a discount within the Peer Center for use in student applications? And it should be peer-wide. It shouldn't just be like at Berkeley or Stanford or someplace. Is that a yes? Okay, you heard it here. Good. We have it on tape. I've served my purpose in coming. I can quit now. In any case, so there were many students that were associated with the effort overall, many. And students were not just those in graduate school, but they were us, because all of us needed to learn about what we were trying to do, and none of us understood all the parts of the elephant. We just didn't, and so we had to spend a lot of time going through these things and learning, and so we were students. We had various student activities. We started out with some very young shaking table ideas. Jerry Pardone led our education program the first several years. And the videos are a little problematic today, but this one I can't get to go. It was fun to see the kids screaming and to see their results at the end, though, you can see. But they loved it, and we don't know what happened to all these kids. We hope we had some impact on them. There is also the case of the seismic competition that EERI is currently running. We started that. And unfortunately, the sound isn't working because you'd be hearing, "Yeah! Ah!" All the screaming, if you've been to this competition. And at one point, it becomes so exciting to watch the students jumping around that the videographer moves away from the specimen and goes to the students. Too bad we don't have sound here today, because it would be really great. Now, if you've ever been to the EERI annual meeting, you know what a distraction this is, right? It takes over the meeting. And when we saw that starting to happen, we got the idea we could distract the NSF site visit committee too. And so we integrated the shaking table competition into the NSF site visits. And it was very distracting. It used up a lot of time. It put smiles on everybody's face, and it turned out it was a really good thing to do for many reasons. And it's been graduated now off into EERI, and is something we do at the EERI conference, because we knew we couldn't sustain that kind of thing once the big NSF funding was gone. But here's a very early version of the winning team from the seismic competition. This is before this was handed over to EERI. You can see the plaque has the Pure logo. And on your left is Scott Ashford, who was the education director here for a while. I don't know if Scott's in the audience, but Scott has told me on several occasions it was a wonderful, fun experience for him, and a real learning experience for him in terms of how to manage things and so on. I think it had an impact, a big impact on his career going forward. We're just lucky that Scott didn't end up in jail for some of the places they went on the retreats and so forth. They were out at I see some heads nodding from former students. But the Student Leadership Council that was formed had things to figure out. I think, Jack, what was going on in this meeting here? I think something had failed during the shipping or something of a structure. Everyone was wondering, how do we avoid these kinds of problems? How do we make this work in a better way? And so it was a great opportunity to learn. But if we look around, we start seeing in these assembled students, and we've got dozens and dozens of pictures of people who've gone on to really very successful, elegant careers. Who do we see? I see Kurt Hazelton, Christine Goulet, Judy Matrani Reiser. Up on the right, Demetrius Vignos. And there's probably a few. There's Wasim Ghanum and probably several others who've gone on to, I think, important careers, partly because they were involved in this center and they learned a new way to do research, and it really made it exciting to think about going into an academic career. And it indeed was one. Accomplishments. Well, there were lots. I'm just going to give a few, and these come out of partly out of the final report at the end of year 10. Greg Deerline decided, somehow they figured out it was my 50th birthday, and the annual meeting turned into a birthday party. And so there's Greg, I think, questioning whether at age 50 I'm on the verge of collapse. So Greg, I'm happy to report that I'm still here. I don't know how much closer I am, but it's really good to still be here. There's Frank McKenna. I think I saw Frank in the room somewhere a little earlier. In one of the early days in the workshops of learning about open seas. But this is a gathering of images and results from work done mainly at UC San Diego by Professors El Gamal and Conte, developing examples of 2- and 3-dimensional soil foundation structure models using open seas. And as we all know, open seas has gone on to be quite a great success. So I think important really to note that. The development of various tools for modeling, for the implementation of performance-based engineering. I think we're seeing the results of having those tools, having the data, having the capabilities to make estimates of ground shaking and response and what it means in terms of performance is really important to have. This is an early photograph of the NGA West folks working on developing the first set of ground motion attenuation relations, and what was hoped to have been great billions of dollars worth of construction savings because of the reductions that were actually observed in spectral ordinates. The building code committees quickly did away with that by defining a maximum direction and so forth, and so not everything turns out as you intended to, but that's okay. And then a result here, just looking at, I think, again, some work out of Stanford. Greg, I think this is it Abby's work? Yeah, Abby Leal's work. Looking at, toward the end of the first 10 years, how can we use some of these tools to understand just how well has modern design codes, how well have those codes changed collapse risk in older existing buildings and in new buildings relative to the older buildings. And so we got many, many, many examples, but it's a lunch break and you should be mixing it up and not paying attention to a talk. So I'm going to close at this point. And this is the cover of the first chapter of the final report of the NSF report on the Earthquake Center. We were very clever. It was one of our information people, very clever to sneak in behind the cover lettering and so forth, various images. And I don't know if some of you know about NSF's famous 3-plane chart about data and tools and then how you implement them into results. And the director of NSF took me aside one day and said, PEER is the only organization that ever figured out how to put the 3-plane chart on the cover. And we did, but we changed it out by this year and it was gone. But this was the first chapter in PEER's existence. The first 10 years, tremendous accomplishments were made in terms of developing data that were oriented toward a common goal, developing the tools that you could assemble those data in a consistent manner so that in the end you could make a statement about what were the consequences of some decisions you made or some changes you made along the way in the design. And it was, I think, a great accomplishment made by the researchers and the students and by the National Science Foundation in investing in this, and the state of California investing in this. But it was just the first chapter, and as we can see by the big crowd that's here today, and the many great accomplishments that we're hearing about and will continue to hear about, that it's been a success and continues as a success. It's not easy. It takes a lot of effort. It takes agreeing to work together, to collaborate, and to figure out what is your part of the elephant and how to put it together to make something that really makes sense. It isn't just your perception of what earthquake engineering is. And I look forward to the next 10 years and wish you all well in a wonderful meeting here today, and I'll be taking part in it. Congratulations, and let's have a great meeting. Thank you.